Cafe owner kicks out elderly black woman. Unaware Johnny Depp is watching. It was a cold afternoon in the small, picturesque town of Willow Creek. The kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone, where the days moved slower and life's troubles were often masked by the warmth of community. The downtown area was lined with quaint shops and bustling cafes, and among them stood the local favorite, Bella's Brew. Known for its aromatic coffee and inviting ambience, Bella's Brew was the spot where the town gathered for chatter and connection. It was in this cozy cafe, with its soft lighting and the hum of quiet conversation, that an extraordinary story began. The tables were nearly full, with people sipping steaming mugs, typing on laptops, or flipping through books. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries. Amid this normalcy, an elderly woman stepped inside. Her name was Mrs. Evelyn. Mrs. Evelyn was a figure of quiet grace. Her soft gray curls framed a face etched with time's touch, her deep brown eyes glimmering with stories untold. She wore a modest coat, patched and worn but clean, and carried a small bag clutched tightly in her hands. She glanced around, as if searching for a friendly face or a place to sit. From a corner table, someone noticed her. Dressed inconspicuously in a worn cap and dark glasses, Johnny Depp had slipped into town seeking solitude from the relentless glare of fame. He sat alone, sipping a latte and scribbling notes in a leather-bound journal. To everyone else, he was just another visitor. But Johnny, with his keen sense of observation and empathy, saw more than most. Mrs. Evelyn approached the counter slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she fished out a few crumpled bills. "Just a small coffee, please," she said in a voice that was soft but carried a quiet dignity. The barista behind the counter, a young woman named Claire, hesitated. She glanced at the money and then at Mrs. Evelyn. Claire's expression shifted to one of uncertainty, as if she wanted to help but didn't quite know how. Before she could say anything, the cafe owner, Mr. Harris, emerged from the back. Mr. Harris was a man who prided himself on running a tight ship. His cafe was his pride and joy, and he demanded perfection from his staff and customers alike. He was known for his brusque manner and an unyielding approach to running his business. Spotting Mrs. Evelyn at the counter, he frowned. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply. Claire stammered. She's ordering a coffee, Mr. Harris." Mr. Harris's gaze shifted to Mrs. Evelyn. His eyes swept over her appearance, lingering on her old coat and worn shoes. He crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "We don't have time for charity cases," he said coldly. "This isn't a soup kitchen." The room fell silent. Conversations halted, and all eyes turned toward the counter. Mrs. Evelyn's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She looked at the money in her hand and then back at Mr. Harris. I'm not asking for charity," she said quietly. "I just wanted a coffee. And I'm saying we have paying customers to serve," Mr. Harris snapped. "If you can't afford it, you're wasting our time." From his corner table, Johnny Depp's pen paused mid-sentence. He lowered his journal and adjusted his glasses, his sharp eyes narrowing as he observed the scene unfolding. He'd seen enough in his lifetime to recognize injustice when it stared him in the face. But for now, he remained silent, watching. Mrs. Evelyn's hands trembled as she tried to explain. I do have the money. It might not be much, but it's all I have." Mr. Harris sighed dramatically, his impatience palpable. "Look, lady, I have a business to run. Either you're ordering or you're leaving. Don't hold up the line." At that moment, Claire's voice wavered. "Mr. Harris, maybe we could just—" But Mr. Harris silenced her with a glare. "Enough. We don't need to lower our standards for anyone." The humiliation in Mrs. Evelyn's eyes was unmistakable. She turned slowly, her shoulders slumping under the weight of the words. She clutched her bag tightly, her steps hesitant as she moved toward the door. Johnny Depp couldn't stay silent any longer. He stood, his movements deliberate, and approached the counter. Despite his casual attire, there was an undeniable presence about him that turned heads. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Is this how you treat people who come into your cafe?" Mr. Harris frowned, clearly annoyed. "I run my business the way I see fit. And who are you to question it?" Johnny tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Just a customer who believes in basic decency. He pulled out his wallet and placed a crisp bill on the counter. This should cover the lady's coffee, and then some. The room buzzed with whispers as people began to recognize him. Claire's eyes widened, and even Mr. Harris faltered, his confidence shaken. But before anyone could say more, Johnny turned to Mrs. Evelyn and extended his hand. "Ma'am, would you join me for a cup of coffee?" he asked, his voice gentle. Mrs. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She hesitated, glancing at the money on the counter and then at Johnny. Slowly, she nodded, a small smile breaking through her sadness. As they sat together, the tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of awe and curiosity. Johnny listened intently as Mrs. Evelyn shared her story, her voice gaining strength with each word. She spoke of her late husband, her years as a teacher, and the struggles she faced in her old age. Johnny's kindness had not only given her a cup of coffee but restored her dignity. Meanwhile, Mr. Harris retreated to his office, clearly unsettled by the turn of events. The cafe staff, emboldened by Johnny's actions, began whispering among themselves, questioning the way things had been run. And the customers? They couldn't stop talking about the man who had stepped in to make a difference. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change the town forever. Mrs. Evelyn's conversation with Johnny was nothing short of transformative. As she shared her story, other patrons strained to catch snippets of the exchange. The cafe, which had moments ago been a hub of judgment and tension, began to feel like a gathering place for compassion. Johnny listened, nodding thoughtfully as Mrs. Evelyn spoke about her love for the town, despite the hardships she faced. "It's not about the money," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Sometimes, it's about being seen, being treated as though you matter." Her words struck a chord, not just with Johnny, but with the others who overheard. People began whispering among themselves, sharing their own observations about how Mr. Harris often dismissed anyone who didn't fit his idea of a model customer. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Johnny leaned forward, his gaze steady and kind. "Mrs. Evelyn, the way you carry yourself, with dignity and grace, that's a gift this world needs. Don't let anyone make you feel invisible." The elderly woman smiled, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, young man. It's been a long time since anyone spoke to me like that." While their conversation unfolded, Claire, the young barista, gathered her courage. She approached their table hesitantly, holding a small tray with a warm scone and a fresh pot of tea. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how you were treated," she said, her cheeks flushed. "This is on me." Mrs. Evelyn's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, dear. You have a kind heart." Claire nodded and turned to Johnny. "I didn't realize who you were," she admitted, "but seeing how you stood up for her, it made me think, we should all do better." Johnny smiled warmly. "It doesn't take much to show kindness, but it can mean the world to someone who needs it." Meanwhile, in the back office, Mr. Harris paced furiously. The whispers outside had reached him, and the realization that a celebrity was involved only fueled his frustration. But beneath his anger was a flicker of doubt. He replayed the moment in his mind. The humiliation in Mrs. Evelyn's eyes, the collective disapproval of his patrons. For the first time, he wondered if his rigid approach to running the cafe had crossed a line. When he finally emerged, the atmosphere in Bella's Brew had shifted dramatically. Customers were chatting animatedly about what had happened, some even offering to pay forward acts of kindness. Claire was busily serving with a newfound confidence, and Mrs. Evelyn sat surrounded by warmth and attention. Johnny had quietly returned to his corner, scribbling once again in his notebook. Mr. Harris cleared his throat loudly, drawing the room's attention. "I'd like to say something," he began, his voice unusually subdued. The chatter died down as all eyes turned to him. Mrs. Evelyn looked up, her expression guarded but curious. "I realize I may have handled things poorly," Mr. Harris continued, his words measured. "I've always believed in running a business with standards, but I see now that I might have forgotten about humanity in the process." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in approval, while others waited, skeptical. He turned to Mrs. Evelyn. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. You came in here looking for a simple cup of coffee, and I failed to treat you with the respect you deserve. I'm sorry." Mrs. Evelyn's face softened. "It takes a big person to admit they were wrong," she said gently. "Thank you." Encouraged by her response, Mr. Harris addressed the room. "From now on, Bella's Brew will be a place where everyone feels welcome. No exceptions." The announcement was met with applause, though Johnny simply observed, his expression thoughtful. As the energy in the room shifted toward hope and renewal, he stood and made his way to the counter. "Mr. Harris," Johnny said, extending his hand, "thank you for taking a step in the right direction." The cafe owner hesitated, but then shook Johnny's hand firmly. "I appreciate what you did today." "You didn't have to, but you did." Johnny smiled faintly. Sometimes, we're placed in situations where doing the right thing is the only option. As Johnny prepared to leave, Mrs. Evelyn rose and hugged him tightly. "You've given me more than you know," she whispered. He nodded, his voice quiet. "You've given this town more than you realize, Mrs. Evelyn. Take care of yourself." Word of the incident spread quickly beyond Bella's Brew. Within days, it became the talk of Willow Creek. People shared the story of the mysterious man who stood up for an elderly woman, and soon enough, Johnny's involvement became an open secret. But more than his celebrity, it was his act of kindness that resonated. Mr. Harris stayed true to his promise. He introduced a pay-it-forward board, where customers could leave notes and prepay for coffee or meals for those in need. Claire became a champion for kindness in the cafe, often going out of her way to make every customer feel valued. As for Mrs. Evelyn, she became a beloved figure in the town, often returning to Bella's Brew where she was greeted warmly. And Johnny? He left as quietly as he had arrived, but his impact lingered. Months later, a letter arrived at Bella's Brew, addressed to the kind people of Willow Creek. Inside was a donation to support community initiatives, signed simply, "A friend." And so, the story of Bella's Brew became a symbol of how small acts of courage and kindness can ripple outward, transforming not just individuals but entire communities.